Hello. Let's get this microphone just a little bit higher. If we can. Right about there. Maybe there. Yes. That will do. Let's see here. It is noon o'clock on this beautiful, glorious Thursday. Welcome, welcome. Today we'll be reading The Golden Touch. While we wait, I'm going to prepare my drink as always. I don't know what I'm doing. Skull Asylum, hello. Good to see you today. We're just preparing a cup of coffee, and then we'll choose some music while we see if we have any more guests joining us for story time. Everybody loves a story. Is the sound okay? I like this background too. Golden afternoon. And if no one was here, I would sing Golden Afternoon from Alice in Wonderland, but I'm not gonna. Because people are looking. Okay, good. Sound is good. Our cup is ready. Let's move the keyboard out of the way. Get everything just so. Let's choose some music. There's the button. Do, 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 do. I have to kill a few more minutes before I begin reading, so let me try a different music. How about we need like summertime sounds. Try this one. How's that? Fields, birds, a running stream, a little tissue from my nose. I think that'll do. It is only 4 minutes after, 4 minutes and 20 seconds exactly, if anybody's so inclined, but I'm not at the moment. I'm just going to read. And we want it to go well, so we need our wits about us. Okay, let's see here. Just another second. I think 5 minutes in is pretty good. So let's get rolling. I am having a field day. Very funny. The Golden Touch. Once upon a time, there lived a very rich man, and a king besides, whose name was Midas. And he had a little daughter, whom nobody but himself ever heard of, and whose name I either never knew or have entirely forgotten. So because I love odd names for little girls, I choose to call her Marigold. This King Midas was fonder of gold than of anything else in the world. He valued his royal crown chiefly because it was composed of that precious metal. If he loved anything better, or half so well, it was the one little maiden who played so merrily around her father's footstool. But the more Midas loved his daughter, the more did he desire and seek for wealth. He thought, foolish man, that the best thing he could possibly do for his dear child would be to bequeath her the immensest pile of yellow, glistening coin that had ever been heaped together since the world was made. Thus, he gave all his thoughts and all his time to this one purpose. If ever he happened to gaze for an instant at the gold-tinted clouds of sunset, he wished that they were real gold, and that they could be squeezed safely into his strong-box. When little Marigold ran to meet him with a bunch of buttercups and dandelions, he used to say, "Po, po, child, if these flowers were as golden as they look, they would be worth the plucking." And yet, in his earlier days, before he was so entirely possessed of this insane desire for riches, King Midas had shown a great taste for flowers. He had planted a garden in which grew the biggest and beautifulest and sweetest roses that any mortal ever saw or smelled. These roses were still growing in the garden, as large, as lovely, and as fragrant as when Midas used to pass whole hours in gazing at them and inhaling their perfume. But now, if he looked at them at all, it was only to calculate how much the garden would be worth if each of the innumerable rose petals were a thin plate of gold. And though he once was fond of music, in spite of an idle story about his ears, which were said to resemble those of an ass, the only music for poor Midas now was the chink of one coin against another. At length, as people always grow more and more foolish unless they take care to grow wiser and wiser, Midas had got to be so exceedingly unreasonable that he could scarcely bear to see or touch any object that was not gold. He made it his custom, therefore, to pass a large portion of every day in a dark and dreary apartment, underground, at the basement of his palace. It was here that he kept his wealth. To this dismal hole, for it was little better than a dungeon, Midas betook himself whenever he wanted to be particularly happy. Here, after carefully locking the door, he would take a bag of gold coin, or a gold cup as big as a wishbowl, or a heavy golden bar, or a peck measure of gold dust, and bring them from the obscure corners of the room into the one bright and narrow sunbeam that fell from the dungeon-like window. He valued the sunbeam for no other reason but that this treasure would not shine without its help. And then would he reckon over the coins in the bag, toss up the bar and catch it as it came down, sift the gold dust through his fingers, look at the funny image on his own face as reflected in the burnished circumference of the cup, and whisper to himself, "O Midas, rich King Midas, what a happy man art thou!" But it was laughable to see how the image of his face kept grinning at him out of the polished surface of the cup. It seemed to be aware of his foolish behavior and to have a naughty inclination to make fun of him. Hi, Voy. Midas called himself a happy man, but felt that he was not yet quite so happy as he might be. The very tip-top of enjoyment would never be reached unless the whole world were to become his treasure room and be filled with yellow metal which should be all his own. Now, I need hardly remind such wise little people as you are that in old times, when King Midas was alive, a great many things came to pass which we should consider wonderful if they were to happen in our own day and country. And on the other hand, A great many things take place nowadays which seem not only wonderful to us, but at which the people of old times would have stared their eyes out. On the whole, I regard our own times as the stranger of the two. But however that may be, I must go on with my story. Midas was enjoying himself in his treasure room one day as usual, when he perceived a shadow fall over the heaps of gold, and looking suddenly up, what should he behold but the figure of a stranger, standing in the bright and narrow sunbeam. It was a young man with a cheerful and ruddy face. Whether it was the imagination of King Midas threw a yellow tinge over everything, or whatever the cause might be, he could not help fancying that the smile with which the stranger regarded him had a kind of golden radiance in it. Certainly, although his figure intercepted the sunshine, there was now a brighter gleam upon all the piled up treasures than before. Even the remotest corners had their share of it, and were lighted up when the stranger smiled, as with tips of flame and sparkles of fire. As Midas knew that he had carefully turned the key in the lock, and that no mortal strength could possibly break into his treasure room, he of course concluded that his visitor must be something more than mortal. It is no matter about telling you who he was. In those days, when the earth was comparatively a new affair, it was supposed to be often the resort of beings endowed with supernatural power, and who used to interest themselves in the joys and sorrows of men, women, and children, half playfully and half seriously. Midas had met such beings before now, and was not sorry to meet one of them again. The stranger's aspect indeed was so good humored and kindly, if not beneficent, that it would have been unreasonable to suspect him of intending any mischief. It was far more probable that he came to do Midas a favor, and what could that favor be unless to multiply his heaps of treasure? The stranger gazed about the room, and when his lustrous smile had glistened upon the golden objects that were there, he turned again to Midas. "You are a wealthy man, friend Midas," he observed. "I doubt whether any other four walls on earth contain so much gold as you have contrived to pile up in this room." "I have done pretty well," answered Midas, in a discontented tone. "But after all, it is but a trifle when you consider that it has taken me my whole life to get it together. If one could live 1,000 years, he might have time to grow rich." "What!" exclaimed the stranger. "Then you are not satisfied?" Midas shook his head. "And pray what would satisfy you?" asked the stranger. "Merely for the curiosity of the thing, I should be glad to know." Midas paused and meditated. He felt a presentiment that this stranger, with such a golden luster in his good-humored smile, had come hither with both the power and the purpose of gratifying his utmost wishes. Now, therefore, was the fortunate moment when we had but to speak and obtain whatever possible or seemingly impossible thing it might come into his head to ask. So he thought and thought and thought, and heaped up one golden mountain upon another in his imagination without being able to imagine them big enough. At last, a bright idea occurred to King Midas. It seemed really as bright as the glistening metal which he loved so much. Raising his head, he looked the lustrous stranger in the face. "Well, Midas," observed his visitor, "I see that you have at length hit upon something that will satisfy you. Tell me your wish." "It is only this," replied Midas. "I am weary of collecting my treasures with so much trouble, and beholding the heap so diminutive after I have done my best. I wish everything that I touch to be changed to gold." The stranger's smile grew so very broad that it seemed to fill the room like an outburst of the sun, gleaming into a shadowy dell where the yellow autumnal leaves, for so looked the lumps and particles of gold, lie strewn in the glow of light. "The golden touch!" exclaimed he. "You certainly deserve credit, friend Midas, for striking out so brilliant a conception. But are you quite sure that this will satisfy you?" "How could it fail?" said Midas. "And will you never regret possession of it?" asked the stranger. What could induce me, asked Midas. I ask nothing else to render me perfectly happy. Be it as you wish, then, replied the stranger, waving his hand in token of farewell. Tomorrow at sunrise you will find yourself gifted with the golden touch. Hello, forever love. The figure of the stranger then became exceedingly bright, and Midas involuntarily closed his eyes. On opening them again, he beheld only one yellow sunbeam in the room, and all around him the glistening of the precious metal which he had spent his life in hoarding up. Whether Midas slept as usual that night, the story does not say. Asleep or awake, however, his mind was probably in the state of a child's, to whom a beautiful new plaything has been promised in the morning. At any rate, day had hardly peeped over the hills when King Midas was broad awake, and stretching his arms out of the bed, began to touch the objects that were within reach. He was anxious to prove whether the golden touch had really come, according to the stranger's promise. So he laid his finger on a chair by the bedside, and on various other things, but was grievously disappointed to perceive that they remained of exactly the same substance as before. Indeed, he felt very much afraid that he had only dreamed about the lustrous stranger, or else that the latter had been making game of him. And what a miserable affair would it be, after all of his hopes? Midas must content himself with what little gold he could scrape together by ordinary means, instead of creating it by touch. All this while, it was only the gray of the morning, with but a streak of brightness along the edge of the sky, where Midas could not see it. He lay in a very disconsolate mood, regretting the downfall of his hopes, and kept growing sadder and sadder until the earliest sunbeam shone through the window and gilded the ceiling over his bed. It seemed to Midas that this bright yellow sunbeam was reflected in rather a singular way on the white covering of the bed. Looking more closely, what was his astonishment and delight when he found that this linen fabric had been transmuted to what seemed a woven texture of the purest and brightest gold. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas started up in a kind of joyful frenzy and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be in his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately a fluted golden pillar. He pulled aside a window curtain in order to admit a clear spectacle of the wonders which he was performing, and the tassel grew heavy in his hand, a mass of gold. He took up a book from the table. At his first touch, it assumed the appearance of such a splendidly bound and gilt-edged volume as one often meets with nowadays. But on running his fingers through the leaves, behold, it was a bundle of thin golden plates, in which all the wisdom of the book had grown illegible. He hurriedly put on his clothes and was enraptured to see himself in a magnificent suit of gold cloth, which retained its flexibility and softness, although it burdened him a little with its weight. He drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with the dear child's neat and pretty stitches running all around the border in gold thread. Somehow or other, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handiwork should have remained just the same as when she climbed his knee and put it into his hand. But it was not worth while to vex himself with a trifle. Midas now took his spectacles from his pocket and put them on his nose, in order that he might see more distinctly what he was about. In those days, spectacles for common people had not been invented, but were already worn by kings, else how could Midas have had any? To his great perplexity, however, excellent as the glasses were, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. But this was the most natural thing in the world, for, on taking them off, the transparent crystal turned out to be plates of yellow metal, and, of course, were worthless as spectacles, though valuable as gold. It struck Midas as rather inconvenient that, with all his wealth, he could never again be rich enough to own a pair of serviceable spectacles. It is no great matter, nevertheless, said he to himself very philosophically. We cannot expect any great good without its being accompanied by some small inconvenience. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of spectacles, at least, if not of one's very eyesight. My own eyesight will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me." Wise King Midas was so exalted by his good fortune that the palace seemed not sufficiently spacious to contain him. He therefore went downstairs and smiled on observing that the balustrade of the staircase became a bar of burnished gold as his hand passed over it in his descent. He lifted the door latch. It was brass only a moment ago, but golden when his fingers quitted it, and emerged into the garden. Here, as it happened, he found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom, and others in all stages of lovely bud and blossom. Very delicious was their fragrance in the morning breeze. Their delicate blush was one of the fairest sights in the world. So gentle, so modest, and so full of sweet tranquillity did these roses seem to be. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than roses had ever been before. So he took great pains in going from bush to bush, and exercised his magic touch most indefatigably, until each individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, were changed to gold. By the time this good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast, and as the morning air had given him an excellent appetite, he made haste back to the palace. What was usually a king's breakfast in the days of Midas, I really do not know and cannot now hope to investigate. To the best of my belief, however, on this particular morning, the breakfast consisted of hot cakes, some nice little brook trout, roasted potatoes, fresh boiled eggs, and coffee for King Midas himself, and a bowl of bread and milk for his daughter Marigold. At all events, this is a breakfast fit to set before a king, and, whether he had it or not, King Midas could not have had a better. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and seating himself at the table, awaited the child's coming in order to begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, he really loved his daughter, and he loved her so much more this morning on account of the good fortune which had befallen him. It was not a great while before he heard her coming along the passageway, crying bitterly. This circumstance surprised him, because Marigold was one of the cheerfulest little people whom you would ever see on a summer's day, and hardly shed a thimbleful of tears in a twelvemonth. When Midas heard her sobs, he determined to put little Marigold into better spirits by an agreeable surprise. So, leaning across the table, he touched his daughter's bowl, which was a china one with pretty figures all around it, and transmuted it to gleaming gold. Meanwhile, Marigold slowly and disconsolately opened the door and showed herself with her apron at her eyes, still sobbing as if her heart would break. "How now, my little lady?" cried Midas. "Pray, what is the matter with you this bright morning?" Marigold, without taking the apron from her eyes, held out her hand, in which was one of the roses which Midas had so recently transmuted. "Beautiful!" exclaimed her father. "And what is there in this magnificent golden rose to make you cry?" "Ah, dear father," answered the child. Excuse me. As well as her sobs would let her. "It is not beautiful, but the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I dressed, I ran into the garden to gather some roses for you, because I know you like them, and like them the better when gathered by your little daughter. But oh, dear me, what do you think has happened? Such a misfortune! All the beautiful roses that smelled so sweetly and had so many lovely blushes are blighted and spoilt. They are grown quite yellow, as you see this one, and have no longer any fragrance. What can have been the matter with them?" "Oh, my little girl, pray don't cry about it," said Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the change which so greatly afflicted her. "Sit down and eat your bread and milk. You will find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that, which will last hundreds of years, for an ordinary one which would wither in a day." "I don't care for such roses as this," cried Marigold, tossing it contemptuously away. "It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose." child now sat down to the table, but was so preoccupied with her grief for the blighted roses that she did not even notice the wonderful transmutation of her china bowl. Perhaps this was all the better, for Marigold was accustomed to take pleasure in looking at the queer figures and strange trees and houses that were painted on the circumference of the bowl, and these ornaments were now entirely lost in the yellow hue of the metal. Midas, meanwhile, had poured a cup of coffee, and as a matter of course, the coffee pot, whatever metal it may have been when he took it up, was gold when he set it down. He thought to himself that it was rather an extravagant style of splendor in a king of his simple habits to breakfast off a service of gold, and began to be puzzled with the difficulty of keeping his treasures safe. The cupboard and the kitchen would no longer be a secure place of deposit for articles so valuable as golden bowls and coffee pots. Hello, Holistic Media. Nice to see you. Amid these thoughts, he lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips, and sipping it, was astonished to perceive that, the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold, and the next moment hardened to a lump. "Ha!" exclaimed Midas, rather aghast. "What is the matter, father?" asked little Marigold, gazing at him, with the tears still standing in her eyes. "Nothing, child, nothing," said Midas. "Eat your milk before it gets quite cold." He took one of the nice little trouts on his plate, and by way of experiment, touched its tail with his finger. To his horror, it was immediately transmuted from an admirably fried brook trout into a gold fish, though not one of those goldfishes which people often keep in glass globes as ornaments for the parlor. No, but it was really a metallic fish, and looked as if it had been very cunningly made by the nicest goldsmith in the world. Its little bones were now golden wires, its fins and tails were thin plates of gold, and there were the marks of the fork in it, and all the delicate frothy appearance of a nicely fried fish exactly imitated in metal. A very pretty piece of work, as you may suppose, only King Midas, just at that moment, would much rather have had a real trout in his dish than this elaborate and valuable imitation of one. "I don't quite see," thought he to himself, "how I am to get any breakfast." He took one of the smoking hot cakes, and had scarcely broken it when, to his cruel mortification, though, a moment before, it had been of the whitest wheat, it assumed the yellow hue of Indian meal. To say the truth, if it had been a hot Indian cake, Midas would have prized it a good deal more than he did now, when its solitary and increased weight made him too bitterly sensible that it was gold. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the trout and the cake. The egg, indeed, might have been mistaken for one of those which the famous goose in the storybook was in the habit of laying, but King Midas was the only goose that had anything to do with the matter. "Well, this is a quandary," thought he, leaning back in his chair and looking quite enviously at little Marigold, who was now eating her bread and milk with great satisfaction. "Such a costly breakfast before me, and nothing that can be eaten." Hoping that, by dint of great dispatch, he might avoid what he now felt to be a considerable inconvenience, King Midas next snatched a hot potato, and attempted to cram it into his mouth and swallow it in a hurry. But the golden touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full, not of mealy potato, but of solid metal, which so burnt his tongue that he roared aloud, and jumping up from the table, began to dance and stamp about the room, both with pain and affright. "Father, dear father," cried little Marigold, who was a very affectionate child, "pray what is the matter? What, have you burnt your mouth?" "Ah, dear child," groaned Midas dolefully, "I don't know what is to become of your poor father." And truly, my dear little folks, did you ever hear of such a pitiable case in all your lives? Here was literally the richest breakfast that could be set before a king, and its very richness made it absolutely good for nothing. The poorest laborer, sitting down to his crust of bread and cup of water, was far better off than King Midas, whose delicate food was really worth its weight in gold. And what was to be done? Already at breakfast, Midas was excessively hungry. Would he be less so by dinner time? And how ravenous would be his appetite for supper, which most undoubtedly consist of the same sort of indigestible dishes as those now before him? How many days, think you, would he survive a continuance of this rich fare? These reflections so troubled wise King Midas that he began to doubt whether, after all, riches are the one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to give up the golden touch for so paltry a consideration as a breakfast. Just imagine what a price for one's meals, victuals. It would have been the same as paying millions and millions of money, and as many millions more as would take forever to reckon up, for some fried trout, an egg, a potato, a hot cake, and a cup of coffee. It would be quite too dear, thought Midas. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of his situation that he again groaned aloud, and very grievously too. Our pretty Marigold could endure it no longer. She sat a moment gazing at her father, and trying, with all the might of her little wits, to find out what was the matter with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she started from her chair, and running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about his knees. He bent down and kissed her. He felt that little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than the golden touch. My precious, precious Marigold, cried he, but Marigold made no answer. Alas, what had he done? How fatal was the gift which the stranger bestowed! The moment the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change had taken place. Her sweet, rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assumed a glittering yellow color, with yellow teardrops congealing on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown ringlets took the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircling arms. Oh, terrible misfortune! The victim of his insatiable desire for wealth, little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there she was, with the questioning look of love, grief, and pity hardened into her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that ever mortal saw. All the features and tokens of Marigold were there. Even the beloved little dimple remained in her golden chin. But the more perfect was the resemblance, the greater was the father's agony at beholding this golden image, which was all that was left him of a daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas, whenever he felt particularly fond of the child, to say that she was worth her weight in gold. And now the phrase had become literally true, and now at last, when it was too late, he felt how infinitely and warm a tender heart that loved him exceeded in value all the wealth that could be piled up betwixt the earth and sky. It would be too sad a story if I were to tell you how Midas, in the fullest of all his gratified desires, began to wring his hands and bemoan himself, and how he could neither bear to look at Marigold nor yet to look away from her. Except when his eyes were fixed on the image, he could not possibly believe that she had been changed to gold. But stealing another glance, there was the precious little figure with a yellow teardrop on its yellow cheek, and a look so piteous and tender that it seemed as if that very expression must needs soften the gold and make it flesh again. This, however, could not be. So Midas had only to wring his hands and to wish that he were the poorest man in the wide world, if the loss of all his wealth might bring back the faintest rose color to his dear child's face. See it happening again? Damn it. While he was in the tumult of despair, he suddenly beheld a stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down his head without speaking, for he recognized the same figure which had appeared to him the day before in the treasure room, and had bestowed on him this disastrous faculty of the golden touch. The stranger's countenance still wore a smile which seemed to shed a yellow luster all about the room, and gleamed on little Marigold's image and on the other objects that had been transmuted by the touch of Midas. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "pray how do you succeed with the golden touch?" Midas shook his head. "I am very miserable," said he. "Very miserable indeed!" exclaimed the stranger. "And how happens that? Have I not faithfully kept my promise with you? Have you not everything that your heart desired?" "Gold is not everything," answered Midas, "and I have lost all that my heart really cared for." "Ah, so you have made a discovery since yesterday," observed the stranger. "Let us see, then. Which of these two things do you think is really worth the most? The gift of the golden touch, or 1 cup of clear cold water?" "Oh, blessed water!" exclaimed Midas. "It will never moisten my parched throat again." "The golden touch," continued the stranger, "or a crust of bread?" "A piece of bread," answered Midas, "is worth all the gold on earth." "The golden touch?" asked the stranger, "or your own little Marigold, warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago?" "Oh, my dear child," cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. "I would not have given that one small dimple in her chin for the power of changing this whole big earth into a solid lump of gold." "You are wiser than you were, King Midas," said the stranger, looking seriously at him. "Your own heart, I perceive, has not been entirely changed from flesh to gold. Were it so, your case would indeed be desperate, but you appear to still be capable of understanding that the commonest things, such as lie within everybody's grasp, are more valuable than the riches which so many mortals sigh and struggle for. Tell me now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch?" "It is hateful to me," replied Midas. A fly settled on his nose, but immediately fell to the floor, for it too had become gold. Midas shuddered. "Go then," said the stranger, "and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take likewise a vase of the same water, and sprinkle it over any object that you may desire to change back again from gold into its former substance. If you do this in earnestness and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief which your avarice has occasioned." King Midas bowed low, and when he lifted his head, the lustrous stranger had vanished. You will easily believe that Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher, but alas me, it was no longer earthen after he touched it, and hastening to the riverside. As he scampered along and forced his way through the shrubbery, it was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if the autumn had been there and nowhere else. On reaching the river's brink, he plunged headlong in without waiting so much to pull off his boots. "Poof, poof, poof!" snorted King Midas as his head emerged out of the water. "Well, this is really a refreshing bath, and I think it must have quite washed away the golden touch. And now for filling my pitcher." As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened his very heart to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earthen vessel which it had been before he touched it. He was conscious also of a change within himself. A cold, hard, and heavy weight seemed to have gone out of his bosom. No doubt his heart had been gradually losing its human substance and transmuting itself into insensible metal, but had now softened back again into flesh. Perceiving a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his finger, and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue, instead of undergoing a yellow blight. The curse of the golden touch had, therefore, really been removed from him. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and I suppose the servants knew not what to make of it when they saw their royal master so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. But that water, which was to undo all the mischief that his folly had wrought, was more precious to Midas than an ocean of molten gold could have been. The first thing he did, as you need hardly be told, was to sprinkle handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. No sooner did it fall on her than you would have laughed to see how the rosy color came back to the dear child's cheek, and how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet, and her father still throwing more water over her. "Pray do not, dear father," cried she. "See how you have wet my nice frock, which I put on only this morning." For Marigold did not know that she had been a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that had happened since the moment when she ran with outstretched arms to comfort poor King Midas. Her father did not think it necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish he had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown. For this purpose, he led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remainder of the water over the rose bushes, and with such good effect that above 5,000 roses recovered their beautiful bloom. There were two circumstances, however, which, as long as he lived, used to put King Midas in mind of the golden touch. One was that the sands of the river sparkled like gold. The other, that little Marigold's hair had now a golden tinge, which he had never observed in it before. She had been trans. This change of hue was really an improvement, and made Marigold's hair richer than in her babyhood. When King Midas had grown quite an old man, and used to trot to Marigold's children on his knee, he was fond of telling them this marvelous story, pretty much as I have now told it to you, and then would he stroke their glossy ringlets, and tell them that their hair, likewise, had a rich shade of gold, which they had inherited from their mother. "And to tell you the truth, my precious little folks," quoth King Midas, diligently trotting the children all the while, "ever since that morning I have hated the very sight of all other gold save this." That is the end of The Golden Touch, the tale of King Midas and what greed can bring. Let's take a quick look through our chatterbox. Forever Love, Mr. Super Sidewinder, Voy, Holistic Media, and Skull Asylum. Happy to see you all today. I love Kung Fu Shaolin. Hola. I love saying that name. That's a good one. Everybody love Kung Fu. What? So it's only, and DN, nice of you to join us. Hello. It's only been 43 minutes. I could read another short story that might turn out to be quite scary from one of the books. Let's get that book. Okay, man, I'm really hoping that like my dress didn't come up and back when I went over there. Oh my God, I'm gonna just absolutely die if it did. Good thing I'm not wearing like, purple polka dotted boxer shorts or something, right? So, what do you say, kids in Neverland? Well, we're big kids. We're grown-ups. This is still a grown-ups only channel, just in case I say a bad swear. Would we like a short story? Let's see. What is in the contents? These are all just a few pages long each. Well, as it relates, we could read The Golden Goose. What say you? Should we read The Golden Goose The golden bird. Those will be our only two choices. One or two. Goose, one for goose, two for bird. They're both birds. I'm going to warm up my coffee. One for goose. That's another one for goose. Yeah. Hi, Mojo Shop. Good to see you today. We're taking a vote. Are we going to hear a short story about the golden goose or the golden bird? One for goose, two for bird. Hi, Ryan. They ain't no jive turkeys in here. Just silly mofos. Hopefully, anyway. And duck. All right. Well, goose wins because I've got 2 votes for goose, and Voy is here, so we got an automatic goose. Okay. And here we go. Let me taste my coffee first, make sure it's good. Of course it is. It's perfect. Excusez-moi. The golden goose is found on page 156. Let us turn there. And here we are. The golden goose. There lived once an old queen whose husband had been dead many years. She had a beautiful daughter who was promised in marriage to a king's son living a great way off. Shoot. When the time appointed for the wedding drew near, I'm sorry. Let me start this over. I kind of screwed the beginning up. There lived once an old queen whose husband had been dead many years. She had a beautiful daughter who was promised in marriage to a king's son living a great way off. When the time appointed for the wedding drew near, and the old queen had to send her daughter into the foreign land, she got together many costly things, furniture and cups and jewels and adornments, both of gold and silver, everything proper for the dowry of a royal princess, for she loved her daughter dearly. She gave her also a waiting gentlewoman to attend her and to give her into the bridegroom's hands, and they were each to have a horse for the journey, and the princess's horse was named Falada, and he could speak. When the time for parting came, the old queen took her daughter to her chamber, and with a little knife she cut her own finger so that it bled, and she held beneath it a white napkin, and on it fell 3 drops of blood. And she gave it, bidding her take care of it, for it would be needful to her on the way. Then they took leave of each other, and the princess put the napkin in her bosom, got on her horse, and set out to go to her bridegroom. After she had ridden an hour, she began to feel very thirsty, and she said to the waiting woman, "Get down and fill my cup that you are carrying with water from the brook." "I will not," Oh, I'm sorry. I have a great desire to drink. Get down yourself, said the waiting woman, and if you are thirsty, stoop down and drink. I will not be your slave. And as her thirst was so great, the princess had to get down and to stoop and drink the water out of the brook, and could not have her gold cup to serve her. Oh dear, said the poor princess, and the 3 drops of blood heard her and said, if your mother knew of this, it would break her heart. But the princess answered nothing and quietly mounted her horse again. So they rode on some miles further. I'm sorry, this is the Goose Girl I'm reading, not the Golden Goose. So there we are. We opened to the wrong page and started reading the Goose Girl. But we take everything as not an accident. There's no coincidences. It is the Goose Girl. Interesting. But the princess answered nothing and quietly mounted her horse again. So they rode on some miles further. The day was warm. The sun shone hot, and the princess grew thirsty once more. And when they came to a watercourse, she called again to the waiting woman and said, get down and give me to drink out of my golden cup. For she had forgotten all that had gone before. But the waiting woman spoke still more scornfully and said, if you want a drink, you may get it yourself. I am not going to be your slave. So, as her thirst was so great, the princess had to get off her horse and to stoop toward the running water to drink. And as she stooped, she wept and said, oh dear. And the 3 drops of blood heard her and answered, if your mother knew of this, it would break her heart. And as she drank and stooped over, the napkin on which were the 3 drops of blood fell out of her bosom and floated down the stream. And in her distress, she never noticed it. Not so the waiting woman, who rejoiced because she would have power over the bride, who, now that she had lost the 3 drops of blood, had become weak and unable to defend herself. And when she was going to mount her horse again, the waiting woman cried, Falada belongs to me, and this jade to you. And the princess had to give way and let it be as she said. Then the waiting woman ordered the princess with many hard words such clothing and to put on her plain garments, and then she made her swear to say nothing of the matter when they came to the royal court, threatening to take her life if she refused. And all the while Falada noticed and remembered. The waiting woman then mounting Falada and the princess, the sorry jade, they journeyed on till they reached the royal castle. There was great joy at their coming, and the king's son hastened to meet them, and lifted the waiting woman from her horse, thinking she was his bride. And then he led her up the stairs, while the real princess had to remain below. But the old king, who was looking out of the window, saw her standing in the yard, and noticed how delicate and gentle and beautiful she was. And he went down and asked the seeming bride who it was that she had brought with her, and that was now standing in the courtyard. Oh, answered the bride, I only brought her with me for company. Give the maid something to do, that she may not be forever standing idle. But the old king had no work to give her, until he bethought him of a boy who had took care of the geese, and that she might help him. And so the real princess was sent to keep geese with the goose boy, who was called Conrad. Soon after, the false bride said to the prince, Dearest husband, I pray thee do me a pleasure. With all my heart, answered he. Then, said she, send for the knacker, that he may carry off the horse I came here upon, and make away with him. He was very troublesome to me on the journey. For she was afraid that the horse might tell someone how she had behaved to the princess. And when the order had been given that Falada should die, it came to the princess's ears, and she came to the knacker's man discreetly, and promised him a piece of gold if he were to do her a service. There was in the town a great dark gateway, through which she had to pass morning and evening with her geese, and she asked the man to take Falada's head and to nail it on the gate, that she might always see it as she passed by. And the man promised, and he took Falada's head and nailed it in fast in the gateway. Early next morning, as she and Conrad drove their geese through the gate, She said as she went by, "O Falada, dost thou hang there?" And the head answered, "Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." But she went on through the town, driving her geese to the field, and when they came into the meadows, she sat down and undid her hair, which was all of gold. And when Conrad saw how it glistened, he wanted to pull out a few hairs for himself. And she said, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after as it flies, while I with my golden hair will play, and twist it up in seemly wise." Then there came a wind strong enough to blow Conrad's hat far away over the fields, and he had to run after it. And by the time he came back, she had put up her hair with combs and pins, and he could not get any of it to pull out. And he was sulky and would not speak to her. So they looked after the geese until the evening came, and then they went home. The next morning, as they passed under the dark gateway, the princess said, "O Falada, dost thou hang there?" And Falada answered, "Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain." And when they reached the fields, she sat down and began to comb out her hair. Then Conrad came up and wanted to seize upon some of it, and she cried, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, make him run after as it flies, while I with my golden hair will play, and do it up in seemly wise." Then the wind came and blew Conrad's hat far away, so that he had to run after it. And when he came back, her hair was put up again, so that he could pull none of it out. And they tended the geese until the evening. And after they had got home, Conrad went to the old king and said, "I will tend these geese no longer with that girl." "Why not?" asked the king. "Because she vexes me the whole day long," answered Conrad. Then the old king ordered him to tell how it was. "Every morning," said Conrad, "as we pass under the dark gateway with the geese, there is an old horse's head hanging on the wall, and she says to it, 'O Falada, dost thou hang there?' And the head answers, 'Princess, dost thou so meanly fare? But if thy mother knew thy pain, her heart would surely break in twain.'" And besides this, Conrad related all that happened in the fields and how he was obliged to run after his hat. The old king told him to go drive the geese next morning as usual, and he himself went behind the gate and listened how the maiden spoke to Falada. And then he followed them into the fields and hid himself behind a bush, and he watched the goose boy and the goose girl tend the geese. And after a while he saw the girl make her hair all loose, and how it gleamed and shone. Soon she said, "O wind, blow Conrad's hat away, and make him follow as it flies, while I with my golden hair will play, and bind it up in seemly wise." Then there came a gust of wind, and away went Conrad's hat, and after it he, while the maiden combed and bound up her hair. And the old king saw all that went on. At last he went unnoticed away, and when the goose girl came back in the evening, he sent for her, and asked the reason of her doing all this. "That I dare not tell you," she answered, "nor can I tell any man of my woe, for when I was in danger all of my life, I swore an oath not to reveal it." And he pressed her sore and left her no peace, but he could get nothing out of her. At last he said, "If you will not tell it to me, tell it to the iron oven." And he went away. Then she crept into the iron oven and began to weep and to lament, and at last she opened her heart and said, "Here I sit forsaken of all the world, and I am a king's daughter, and a wicked waiting woman forced me to give up my royal garments and my place at the bridegroom's side, and I am made a goose girl, and have to do mean service, and if my mother knew, it would break her heart." Now the old king was standing outside by the oven door listening, and he heard all that she said. And he called to her and told her to come out of the oven. And he caused royal clothing to be put upon her, and it was a marvel to see how beautiful she really was. The old king then called his son and proved to him that he had the wrong bride, for she was really only a waiting woman, and that the true bride was here at hand, she who had been the Goose Girl. The prince was glad at heart when he saw her beauty and gentleness, and a great feast was made ready, and all the court people and good friends were bidden to it. The bridegroom sat in the midst with the princess on one side and the waiting woman on the other, and the false bride did not know the true one, because she was dazzled with her glittering braveries. When all the company had eaten and drunk and were merry, the old king gave the waiting woman a question to answer, as to what such a one deserved, who had deceived her masters in such and such a manner, telling the whole story, and ending by asking, "Now, what doom does such a one deserve?" "No better than this," answered the false bride, "that she be put naked into a cask, studded inside with sharp nails, and be dragged along in it by 2 horses from street to street till she be dead." "Thou hast spoken thy own doom," said the old king. "As thou hast said, so shall it be done." And when the sentence was fulfilled, the prince married the true bride, and ever after they ruled over their kingdom in peace and blessedness. That one wasn't as sad, although they did kill the talking horse, but it still spoke afterwards, so that's interesting. It's also interesting that I thought I was going for the golden goose, and I ended up reading The Goose Girl, but that's a good story. People be trying to steal other people's destiny and stuff, and you know what? There's only one you. There's only one you. You are not replaceable. That's just true. That's true everywhere for everyone. One you. And while we're all part of one big thing, the experience that is you is unique and valuable. So there's your little lesson from a beautiful children's story. Aww. So I guess that filled our full hour. A good little reading time for those of y'all on a commute or a lunch hour, wherever you may be. Let's take a glance through our chatterbox and see how our guests fared today at these royal tales of woe. We had Forever Love, Mr. Super Sidewinder, Voy, Unindoctrinated, DN. I know that up here I had Mojo Shop, Lev Kung Fu Shaolin, and I had Holistic Media and Skull Asylum. Any other visitors this afternoon? I think that I have caught all. If I did miss anyone, I apologize, and I'll catch you next time in my shout-outs. Thank you all for joining me for Thursday's story time, all about geese and gold and crazy shit. I don't know. I have nothing else really to say, so I'm gonna held your tail the whole time. I'm gonna let it go there and wish you all happy hours, brightest blessings, and a beautiful day. Be well, and I will see you soon. Much love, past, present, and future, wherever you are. I guess I don't have to lean up, huh? I can sit back now. Much love. Have a great day. Love you, all that stuff.